The moment my father introduced me to 300 people as the one who changes bedpans for a living, I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. I just stood there at the edge of the ballroom and let him finish. Because I knew something he didn't. I had known it for 8 months. And I had been waiting for exactly this moment. Let me back up. I grew up understanding that in my father's world, you were only as valuable as your title, not your character, not what you built, not who you helped. Your title. He had 3 of them, doctor, professor, and chairman, and he wore them like armor everywhere he went. At the dinner table, at church, at my school plays, where he'd correct the other parents about his credentials while I stood in a paper crown on stage, scanning the crowd for his face. He found it early. The thing that made me feel small. I was 22, fresh out of college with a social work degree, and I had just accepted a position at a residential substance use recovery center in Portland. It wasn't glamorous. The pay was modest. The hours were brutal in a way no one prepares you for. But I loved it. I loved the work in a way I had never loved anything. The slow, unglamorous, holy work of sitting with someone at their lowest and not leaving. My father called it playing nursemaid. He said it at Thanksgiving in front of my aunt and my cousins and my grandmother, who had raised him and who looked down at her plate when he said it. You spent 4 years at a university for this? To change bedpans and hold hands? I told him the center didn't have inpatient beds. He didn't care. The image was what he wanted, something to diminish. I watched his face as he said it, and I understood that he wasn't angry. He wasn't even disappointed. He was embarrassed. His daughter, who could have gone to law school or gotten an MBA, had chosen to work with people he considered beneath him. A year later, when I told him I'd been promoted to program director, he asked how much it paid. I told him. He laughed. Not cruelly, that almost would have been easier. He laughed the way you laugh at a child who tells you they want to be an astronaut. Fond, dismissive, final. You could still change course, he said. You're young. You don't have to make this your life. But I was already making it my life. Our center, Ridgemont Recovery, had started small. A converted Victorian in northeast Portland with 12 beds and a waiting list twice that long. By the time I became program director, we were serving close to 80 clients at any given time. We ran family support groups on Saturday mornings. We partnered with the county public health office. We had a garden program that a local news station came to film once, and my father saw the segment and called me. And the only thing he said was, "You looked tired on camera." He had his own nonprofit by then, the Whitmore Institute, named after himself naturally. It was a foundation that claimed to support arts education in underserved communities, and it had a beautiful website and a very impressive board and an annual gala at the Hotel Adrian every January that he hosted like a visiting dignitary. I had been to 2 of them. I stopped going after the second one when he introduced me to a colleague by saying, "This is my daughter. She works in social services," the way he said social services like he was pronouncing a medical diagnosis. I didn't go the next year or the year after that. I told him I was busy. He didn't push. I think he preferred it, honestly, preferred not to explain me. What he didn't know, what he had no idea about, was what had happened in the 18 months since I'd last seen him. I had gone back to school part-time. I'd gotten a certificate in nonprofit administration and then, because I couldn't stop, a master's in public policy. It took me 3 years. I did it at night and on weekends with 2 other women from my cohort who became my closest friends, and we would meet at one of their apartments on Sunday evenings with takeout containers and highlighted textbooks and a shared low-grade fury that kept us all going. When I graduated, I applied for a position at the Oregon Department of Human Services, specifically in the division that manages state grants for community-based behavioral health programs. Programs like mine, Programs like every small recovery center in the state that survived on a combination of Medicaid reimbursements and competitive grant funding from exactly the agency where I now worked. I got the job. Senior Grants Analyst. I started in March. By April, I was reviewing my first cycle of applications. By June, the application for the Whitmore Institute came across my desk. I want to be clear about what happened next, because the version of events my father would later tell to anyone who would listen, apparently, is that I acted out of spite, that I weaponized a public agency for personal revenge. That's not what happened. What happened is that I did my job. I read the Whitmore Institute's application carefully, very carefully, because when you work in behavioral health services and you understand what genuine community investment looks like, certain things stand out. The budget, for instance. Their proposed budget allocated 62% of the grant funds to administrative costs. In my field, that is a red flag the size of a building. Most credible nonprofits keep administrative overhead under 25%. The Whitmore Institute wanted $340,000 in state funding, and $210,000 of that was going to operational infrastructure, which, when I dug into the supporting documents, meant office renovation, a part-time communications consultant, and a series of speaking engagements at which my father was the speaker. There was more. Their reported outcomes from the previous grant cycle, which I'd pulled from our system, were substantially below what they'd projected. They promised arts programming for 600 students in Title I schools. The follow-up documentation showed they'd reached fewer than 200, and the documentation itself was thin, attendance logs with inconsistent dates. A single testimonial letter from a school principal who, when I cross-checked the address, worked at a school that had closed the previous year. I flagged the application. I documented everything. I brought it to my supervisor, who brought it to the division director, who said the same thing I was thinking. This needs a second review. The second review confirmed my concerns. The application was denied. I recused myself from the formal decision. Full disclosure to my supervisor about the family relationship, and the denial letter went out under my supervisor's signature in late October. My father did not take it quietly. He called the department. He sent a letter to the director. He left a voicemail for my supervisor that was, apparently, long enough to require a follow-up documentation meeting. He said the denial was politically motivated. He said there had been a conflict of interest. He never said my name. I don't think he knew I was there. Not yet. But he threatened to contact his state representative and expose the bureaucratic overreach that had cost his foundation critical funding. The investigation he triggered found no wrongdoing. It also, as a byproduct, flagged 3 additional compliance concerns in the Whitmore Institute's prior grant history that had never been properly closed out. Those were referred to a different office. I didn't ask which one. He found out I worked there sometime in November. I'm not sure how. I imagine someone on his board made a phone call, or he saw something on LinkedIn, or the universe just decided it was time. He called me on a Tuesday evening. I was in my kitchen making pasta when my phone lit up with his name, and I stood there for a second looking at it before I answered. "How long?" he said without a greeting. "Hello, Dad. How long have you worked there?" 8 months. The silence was long enough that I finished stirring the pasta sauce. Then he said, "Did you deny my grant?" I recused myself from the final decision. That's not what I asked. I flagged the application for review. The review found multiple compliance issues. The denial was made by my supervisor. Another silence. Then, "You did this deliberately." I did my job. I built that foundation from nothing. 20 years. And you... He stopped. When he came back, his voice had changed. Lower. Harder. The voice he used when he was deciding something. "We're done. Do you understand me? Whatever this was between us, we're done." I had heard some version of that before. The first time, I was 19 and I told him I wasn't going to apply to business school. I had learned, by now, not to chase after it. I said, "Okay, Dad," and he hung up. I finished making the pasta. The gala was in January, as always. I hadn't planned to go. I hadn't been invited. We were done, after all. But one of his board members, a woman named Sandra Alcott, who had been a friend of my mother's before my parents divorced, reached out to me in late December. She'd heard about the grant denial. She'd heard about the compliance review. She wanted to talk. We met for coffee. She told me what she'd been seeing from the inside for the past 3 years. The same patterns I'd found in the paperwork, but from someone who had watched them happen in real time. The speaking fees that came out of program budgets. The catering bills at donor events that got coded as community outreach. The student attendance numbers that got inflated in reports because no one was checking. She asked me what I thought she should do. I told her I couldn't give her legal advice. I told her I knew people she could talk to. I made a phone call to someone I knew at the Oregon Department of Justice, not on her behalf officially, just to ask a general question about how someone in her position might proceed if they had concerns about a nonprofit's financial practices. The person I called to me about a tip line. I passed that information to Sandra. What Sandra did with it was her business. What I know is that by the time the gala came around in January, there were people paying attention who had not been paying attention before. I found out the day before the event that my father had been telling his donors that the grant denial had been overturned. He had not. He was telling them the Whitmore Institute would be receiving full state funding in the new fiscal year. It would not. He had sent a letter to several major donors, people who had pledged significant matching funds contingent on the state grant, assuring them that everything was resolved. It was not resolved. In any sense. I went to the gala. I did not tell him I was coming. I arrived 20 minutes after the cocktail hour started, wearing a dress I'd bought 2 years ago for a friend's wedding. I signed in at the registration table with my name, got a name tag, and walked into the Hotel Adrian's ballroom like I belonged there. I did not make a scene at cocktail hour. I found Sandra at the far end of the room near the floral arrangements, and she saw me and gave me a small nod, and I got a glass of sparkling water and waited. My father spotted me about 40 minutes in. I watched him see me, watched the specific sequence of his face, which went from recognition to confusion to something controlled and flat that I recognized as his public composure snapping into place. He walked over. "What are you doing here?" he said quietly. "Supporting arts education," I said. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "You need to leave." "I don't think I do." He held my gaze for 3 seconds, then turned and walked back toward his table. I watched him sit down. I watched him straighten his jacket and pick up his fork and say something to the woman on his left that made her laugh, and I thought, he's going to pretend this isn't happening. He's going to get up on that stage and talk about community investment and student outcomes and how much the Whitmore Institute has accomplished. And he's going to do it in front of 300 people who have no idea. He got up on that stage. He talked about community investment. He thanked his major donors. He talked about the upcoming programming year and what they plan to accomplish with, and here he paused, with the particular pause of a man building to an announcement, their renewed state partnership. And then he looked out at the crowd and he said, "I'd like to introduce a few people tonight who have been with us from the beginning." And he named 4 or 5 names, and at the end he said, "And my daughter, who some of you may know, she's always been passionate about helping people, even when she chose a more unconventional path." And he paused in a way that let the air under that word breathe. The woman next to him smiled. A few people applauded politely. He was not expecting what came next. I walked to the stage. I didn't rush. I walked the way you walk when you've had months to think about this and you've decided, calmly and completely that you're going to see it through. I walked up the stairs at the side of the stage, and I held out my hand to my father, and I said quietly enough that only he could hear, "I'll take the mic." He didn't hand it to me. I reached over and took it. Gently. The way you take something that doesn't belong to someone anymore. I turned to the room. "Thank you," I said. "It's good to be here." The room was quiet in that particular way a room gets when something unexpected has happened and no one is sure yet what it means. My father mentioned I chose an unconventional path. That's true. I have a master's in public policy and I work as a Senior Grants Analyst at the Oregon Department of Human Services, specifically in the division that manages state grants for community-based programs. I paused. Programs like this one? I heard the quality of the silence change. I want to share something with everyone here because you deserve accurate information before you make any pledging decisions tonight. I looked out at the room, at the donors and the board members, and the people from the arts community who had come because they genuinely believed in the work. The Whitmore Institute's application for state grant funding in the current cycle was denied. It was not overturned. There is no renewed state partnership. The denial was based on documented compliance concerns, including a 62% administrative overhead rate and significant discrepancies between the prior cycle's projected and actual program outcomes. The room was very, very quiet. Several of you received correspondence this month indicating that state funding had been secured. That correspondence was inaccurate. I wanted you to know that directly so that any commitments you're considering can be made with complete information. My father said my name once, like a warning. I looked at him. He had not moved from his spot on the stage. His face had done something I had never seen it do. It had lost its architecture, just for a moment. The certainty that held his features in place had slipped, and underneath it he looked like something smaller. "I love you, Dad," I said. And I meant it, in the complicated, bruised way I had always meant it. But you told these people something that wasn't true. And they came here because they want to do real good in the world. They deserve to know. I set the microphone down on the podium. I walked off the stage. Sandra was waiting at the edge of the room. She handed me my coat. We walked out together into the January cold, and I stood on the sidewalk in front of the Hotel Adrian and breathed in air that tasted like rain and the particular cleanness of a thing that is finally finished. I found out later that 3 major donors withdrew their pledges that night. The board held an emergency meeting the following week. The compliance review that had been quietly proceeding for 2 months moved into a more formal phase, and my father retained an attorney. He called me once more about 10 days later. He did not threaten, he did not apologize. He said, "I don't understand you," in a voice that sounded genuinely lost, and I almost felt sorry for him. I did feel something for him, something that didn't have a clean name. "I know," I said. "I gave you everything I had. You gave me a lot," I said, "and some of it hurt. And I'm still here." He didn't say anything after that. The call ended. I don't know what happens next between us. I'm not ready to know. I know that somewhere in the state system, a file exists with his foundation's name on it, and it will be dealt with by people whose job it is to deal with it, the same way my job was to flag what I found and document it accurately and let the process work. I know that 80-some people are in recovery right now at Ridgemont, and they didn't get there because someone important funded them generously. They got there because people who are willing to do unglamorous work showed up every day and stayed. I know that the morning after the gala, I drove to work in the rain, and I got a coffee from the cart on the corner, and I walked into my office and opened my laptop and started reviewing the next application in the queue. And I know that when my father introduced me to 300 people as the one who chose an unconventional path, he had no idea he was describing the most precise, deliberate, methodical choice I'd ever made. He thought he was landing a small blow. He didn't know the ground had already shifted under him. He never does until it's too late to find his footing. There's something nobody tells you about doing the right thing quietly for years. It doesn't feel heroic while it's happening. It just feels like showing up, reviewing the next file, writing the next memo, driving to work in the rain, and getting coffee from the corner cart and opening your laptop like it's any other Tuesday. That's what integrity actually looks like from the inside. Not a speech, not a dramatic moment, just the daily unglamorous choice to do your work, honestly, even when no one is watching, even when the person benefiting from your silence is someone you once loved without question. My father spent 20 years building something on the assumption that love is conditional and hierarchy is permanent. He believed that if he controlled the narrative, who I was, what my work was worth, how I was introduced in rooms that mattered to him, he controlled reality. And for a long time, I let that belief go unchallenged. Not because I agreed with it, because I was still trying to be the daughter he wanted, even after it became clear that daughter didn't exist in any form he would ever accept. What changed wasn't my anger. I'd had that for years. What changed was my understanding. There's a difference between reacting from hurt and acting from clarity. When I flagged the Whitmore Institute's application, I wasn't thinking about the dinner where he laughed at my salary or the Thanksgiving where he called my work playing nursemaid. I was thinking about the 200 students whose outcomes were reported as 600. I was thinking about the recovery centers that applied honestly and got passed over. I was doing my job, that's all. That's the whole thing. But here's what I've come to understand about cause and effect. Separate from anything as tidy as karma or cosmic justice, actions accumulate. Every inflated number in a grant report, every dollar coded to the wrong line item, every letter sent to donors with information that wasn't true. Those things don't disappear. They sit in files. They wait for someone whose job it is to look carefully. My father assumed no one would look carefully. He had spent decades in rooms where no one looked carefully at him because he had the right titles and the right posture and the right way of filling a room. He mistook that for safety. It wasn't safety. It was just luck, running out slowly. I think about the younger version of me, the one who was 22 and frightened and deeply, stubbornly in love with work that no one around her seemed to respect. She didn't know yet that the thing that felt like a weakness was actually her entire foundation. She just kept going. She went back to school at night. She took the exam she was terrified of. She applied for the job that felt too far above her and then did that job with everything she had. That's not a small thing. That's the whole architecture of everything that followed. What I want, if anyone watching this takes anything away, is this: your integrity is not decorative, it's structural. The years you spend doing honest work in rooms where no one applauds you are not wasted years. They are the years that determine what you're capable of when it actually counts. And your mind, sharpened by study and failure and trying again, is not something anyone can take from you by mocking your job title at a dinner table. The two most powerful things I walked into that ballroom with weren't a government badge or a documented compliance file. They were the knowledge that I had done nothing I was ashamed of and the willingness to stay standing when someone tried to make me feel small in public. My father thought he was introducing me. He was actually giving me the microphone. He just didn't know it yet.